We have a number of items on our agenda this afternoon. The first group of items we're going to do, there's a number of solemnization of marriage bills. Senator Lynch Prada moves that we vote on the bills as a block, seconded by Senator Archibald, and their bills number 7018, 7019, 7020, 7095, 7096, 7133, 7134, 7135, 7136, 7137, 7138, and 7139. All in favor of voting on the bills as a block signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Senator Lynch Prada moves passage of the block, seconded by Senator Archibald. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Senator Metz wants to abstain on 718 and 7019. Same for Senator Lombardi? Yes. Without objection, so ordered. The next bill we're going to do is bill number 2102. Senator Lombardi? This is your bill last year?
Yes, it's the same bill that we passed.
2102.
Just facilitates the whole weighted evidence title situations.
If anyone does anyone have any questions? We do have Mr. Million here from one of the title companies. No questions. Senator Lombardi moves passage, seconded by Senator Lynch Prada. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Can you get him a copy of the bill? The next bill we'll do is Senator Archibald's bill 2109. Senator Archibald, if you want to endeavor to explain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill was similarly passed last year in its exact form, and essentially what it does is it gives the law enforcement officer or animal control officer who takes possession of an animal that's been confined in a motor vehicle 72 hours to hold that animal pending a district court hearing with respect to medical fees, costs, and other associated issues with the animal and or ultimate surrender of the animal. It's a good bill, and I'd ask that it be passed out of committee.
Are there any questions or comments? There's no one here to speak on the bill. Senator Archibald moves passage, seconded by Senator Lynch Prada. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The bill passes. The next bill we're going to do is Senator Lynch Prada's bill 2224. Senator Lynch Prada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the bill we've passed for the last several years running relative to the Joint Committee of the Repealer, which would put together a committee to compile suggestions to repeal certain statutes, regulations, and executive orders that basically would stunt economic development and are there just because they've never been revoked.
Does anyone have any questions of the sponsor? Thank you. Senator G.
No, we've passed it the last several years running. We passed it last year, both out of committee and out of the chamber. The House has not passed it, but this, I want to say this is, we passed it the last 4 years.
Are there any other questions or comments? Senator Lynch Prada moves passage, seconded by Senator G. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The bill passes. The next bill we'll do is Senator Chacon's bill, bill number 2103. And this is a bill that we passed last year that would require property owners to maintain trees and shrubbery that create a nuisance to an abutting property owner. There's no one here to testify for or against the bill. Senator Lynch Prada moves passage, seconded by Senator Nesselbush. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the bill passes. Senator Nesselbush wants to vote in the affirmative on the marriage bills that we previously did. Without objection, so ordered. The next bill we're going to do is Senator Chacon's bill number 2105, and this would sets forth a process for tenants to retrieve their abandoned personal property from a former dwelling unit that's been placed in storage. This is a bill that we passed last year. There's no one here to speak against the bill. Senator Lynch Prada moves passage, seconded by Senator Raptakis. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the bill passes. The next bill we have is Senator Fogarty's bill, bill number 2109. And what this bill would do, Bill 226, and what this bill would do would allow law enforcement agencies to keep proceeds from confiscated property. We do have a couple of people signed up to testify in opposition of the bill. Hillary Davis and Randall Rose. Mr. Rose, if you want to come forward, please. Good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. So this bill doesn't change. This bill doesn't do anything to change net revenue. It just says that property confiscated by the police, instead of going to the general fund, will go to the police departments. And it says if the property has not been retrieved by the owner within 6 months. So if the owner has not managed to retrieve, the original owner has not managed to retrieve possession to it within 6 months, then even if the owner has an action pending, I think this bill says that the owner's property goes to the police department, even if the owner has an action pending in court for after 6 months' time. So this doesn't affect total revenue. So it really does not affect funding of police departments. Police departments can still be funded at the same level. But what it does is it creates an incentive for police departments to seize property. And when police departments seize properties under civil forfeiture laws, there's a low standard of proof. The original owner of the property, if he wants to get it back, has to prove by a preponderance of evidence in rem action that the property was rightfully his, and it's the police department does not have to prove that the property was used for any wrong purpose. So because there's this low standard of proof, unfortunately, if there are any bad apples in the police department, they may confiscate something for the police department's use with a low standard of proof. And even if they're well-intentioned, the fact that they stand to gain financially may bias their judgment. So I think since this doesn't impact total revenue, we don't want to create these kinds of incentives, and it's better not to have the revenue go to the general fund as existing law says. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments for Mr. Rose? Senator Archibald.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments, Randall. I think you're right on the money with all of it. And I had a recent civil forfeiture case that I represented someone on. We recovered a pretty good sum. But you're right on the money with your comments. I appreciate it. No pun intended.
Thank you. Before we proceed, Senator Jabbour wants to vote in the affirmative on the previous legislation that we voted on and that he was at another committee that he's on. So ordered without objection. Are there any other questions or comments? Does anyone else present wish to speak on this legislation? At this point in time, Senator Jabbour moves to hold for further study, seconded by Senator Lynch. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, the bill is held for further study. The next bill we're going to do is Senator DePalma's bill 2233. Senator DePalma, if you want to come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I will be brief as I need to get back to finance to talk about roadworks a little bit more. The bill we have before you is a bill you heard last year and a bill you passed. So thank you for hearing it last year, and thank you for passing it last year. We'll be making the same request this year. The bill has not materially changed from last year. It hasn't changed at all. It's the identical bill from last year. And what you'll see, and it seeks to clean up some of the language of a bill that was put in place in 2011. And it has to do with changing a conservation easement. Rupert Friday will come up after me from the Rhode Island Land Trust, Land Trust Council, and Chuck Allett is also here from the Quinnic Land Trust to talk about the rationale why. So let's talk about the rationale why. I'm always a firm believer in talking about why first before we talk about what it does. They were looking to try and modify a conservation easement that they have. Based on the language that was put in place in 2011, their concern was, after legal counsel review, that if it went before the court for review, the court may review and say that the conservation is no longer valid based on the change that they were looking to make. So rather than have the language that's there, they're looking for some modification to the language that said it had a combination of both termination of an easement and amendment of an easement. So the language you have before you, and you'll see it's on page 2 of the language. At the bottom of page 1, where it talks about termination or amendment, on page 1, line 16, it tries to clean up that language and says that language here only for termination of a conservation easement as opposed to amendment. What it seeks to do, so let's take that first thing is, why are they doing it? We talk about why, how do we want to make this accomplished? If I ask you to turn to page 2, lines 3 through line 6 or line 7, here where it talks to amending a conservation easement that would allow the court to look at a net material gain in the conservation easement. So for instance, specifically, Land Trust can bring it before the court to modify a conservation easement, and many folks here probably have been involved with it. I have from a council perspective at the local level, and we've always said that having more than 2 folks or more than 2 parties involved in an easement is critical. When you only have 2, I can easily convince someone else to think about my thinking or what I'm thinking about and cause that to change. When you have 3 parties, it's a little more difficult. What this seeks to do is allow the court to look at the modification of a conservation easement and look at a material gain or a net gain and allow that to be approved, as opposed to the language that was there earlier and the legal counsel for the land trust looking at that saying, we can't go forward with this, we don't want to potentially lose or have the court decide that the easement would be null and void, and think about the ramifications to that if the person who donated that property and took the value of that donation 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years later, what's going to happen there? So it's out of the abundance of caution, they're looking at this. That's a description of the bill here. I'll thank you for passing it last year. Obviously, with our quick termination last year, abrupt termination, it didn't make it forward. Similar stay, I think, on the House. So, and some experts will be coming up after me to speak on it.
Are there any questions or comments for the sponsor? Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
The next 2 witnesses we have are Rupert Friday and Chuck Allott. If you can both come forward, please. And we'll start with you, Rupert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Rupert Friday with the Rhode Island Land Trust Council. I'd like to thank Senator De Palma for sponsoring this legislation. And as he explained, it really clarifies the standard that the court reviews and separates the standard of when it's reviewing an easement that is being proposed to terminate from the standard being reviewed for amending a conservation easement. So it makes that clarification. And Chuck Allett's here from Quinnic Land Trust. And when we passed this legislation, some of the land trusts and the Quinnic Land Trust started working with it, ran into some unintended consequences. And this is to clarify and resolve the unintended consequences. And Chuck's an attorney. He can explain in more detail if you have questions about the problems that we've run into and why we're changing it. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Friday? Thank you. Sir, you can proceed.
Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Chuck Allett. I am the executive director of the Aquidneck Land Trust. We conserve land on Aquidneck Island in Senator De Palma's district. We were fully in support of this legislation that essentially put public safeguards on any amendment or termination of a conservation easement and required that the Attorney General's office actually be a part of that process. We have no problem with that. But the language that was used in the legislation for an amendment does create an unintended consequence where if we were to go to court, one of the possible outcomes is for the court to find that our easement has no public benefit. No land trust is going to voluntarily go to court when that is a possible outcome of that litigation. And more appropriately, that's not the standard we should be looking at when we're amending a conservation easement. It should truly be whether there is a net conservation gain by what we're doing in amending the conservation easement. Quite often, the amendments that we're seeking to place on the conservation easement truly do benefit the public. It's a better easement with the amendment than without it. And with the statute as it currently is, we can't really amend that conservation easement to improve it. This language would allow us to do so by creating a standard that the court would look at whether there is a net conservation gain through the amendment. So we think that this is totally appropriate, and we would ask the committee to rule favorably on this legislation.
Are there any questions or comments? Senator Metz and Senator Archibald.
Yes, can you just explain that piece to me? I was trying to listen very carefully, but I missed something there about the when you talked about the unintended consequences and you mentioned the easements. Can you just run that through me one more time?
Sure.
And give me an example. I'm a retired educator. I'm not like my buddies here. And sisters. Yes,
So when we conserve land, one of the instruments that we use to do so is a conservation easement. Unlike any other kind of easement, it is perpetual in nature. Statutorily, it will go on forever. Because of that, it's important that there is some mechanism by which you can amend that document because it has such a lasting effect. So the amendment is truly important from a conservation perspective, because no one's going to put a conservation easement on their property if there is absolutely no way to amend it ever in the future. So what the legislation was originally intended to do was to create a safeguard so that private land trusts weren't putting amendments on these conservation easements that are intended to be for the public benefit. They're funded with many times with both public and private dollars. The intent was to make sure that if there was going to be an amendment, that the Attorney General's office was somehow involved and that a court was looking at it to ensure that it was in fact in the public benefit. But the language that was used in creating the standard by which the court would look at whether the amendment was appropriate, the statute actually says the court has to find that the easement document has no public benefit, which would be just that is the appropriate standard if you're looking at terminating an easement. It makes total sense that you would look at, well, does it or does it not have any private or public benefit? But with an amendment, that's not what we should be looking at. We should be looking at, is it increasing, enhancing the conservation values on the property? And that's what we have inserted, is that the amendment would have a different standard. The court would look at whether there's a net conservation gain through the amendment process.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Senator Archibald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could net conservation gain be defined monetarily as in addition to some type of benefit that is in land?
I don't think that it ever could. There are pretty defined conservation values that we are saving in the land. It's scenic, it's farmland, it's watershed protection, it's habitat protection. We spell out in the conservation easement what those conservation values are, and it also has to meet the statutory definition of a conservation restriction in order to get the benefits of the statute. So I would say that that is not a possibility.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Hearing none, Senator Jabor moves passage, seconded by Senator Lynch-Prata. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the bill passes. The last bill we have is Bill number
Thank you, Mr.
2229.
Chairman.
Is there anyone present to speak on Bill 2229? Senator Jabour moves to hold for further study, seconded by Senator Lynch Prata. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, the bill's held for further study. We have no further bills on our agenda this afternoon. Senator Conley moves to adjourn, seconded by Senator G. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, we're adjourned. The bill that